This video is brought to you by Surfshark. Hit up surfshark.deal/Gaijin and use the code Gaijin to get 83% off a 2-year plan plus 3 months extra for free. Hey everyone, Gaijin Goombah here, and welcome back to another episode of Witch Samurai. So back in August of 2019, I tossed out a little Witch Ninja video talking about the true-to-life reflections of traditional shinobi within the newest set of the granddaddy of all card games, Magic the Gathering. But little did I know that I just unleashed the floodgates of interest for not just ninja, but all manner of militaristic Japanese culture in this tabletop classic. See, Modern Horizons wasn't the set that brought the ninjutsu mechanic into the game. Oh no. It only re-established it with a few other older mechanics. What actually brought ninjutsu into game were the 3-block set of Kamigawa that ran from 2004 to 2005, filled with all kinds of not just ninja, but samurai. Tons and tons of samurai. And like clockwork, as soon as I released that Witch Ninja, there was call after call for me to look into the samurai of Magic the Gathering and see just how historically influenced they were.
Yeah, not to mention another set of Kamigawa released just 2 months back. But this block, Neon Dynasty, has a narrative that's set over 1,200 years after the events of the original Kamigawa block. However, despite that time jump, Kamigawa Neon Dynasty comes packed with its own share of futuristic ninja, samurai, and yokai. So with the establishment of Witch Samurai and the hype of the new block, we figured, yeah, let's finally have a look at the samurai mechanics of the game and see just how historically they compare, just like we did with ninja. But where to start?
Well, ponder that for a second, because I gotta give a big shout out to this video sponsor, Surfshark. Much in the way that Ieyasu Tokugawa required a network of Iga and Koga shinobi to keep him safe as he traveled back to Mikawa after his master Oda Nobunaga was betrayed by Akechi Mitsuhide, we all need our own network of back channels and covert assistants to keep us safe from prying eyes and would-be assailants online. And that is exactly what Surfshark does. With Surfshark's VPN program, your IP address is forwarded to another hidden location and IP address. Then from there, you can browse the web under the guise of this secondary IP address. This means that you're protected from IP and DNS leaks, so things like malicious programs or identity thieves can't figure out where you're connecting from. Surfshark was also chosen as the PCMag.com editor's choice for security maximalists.
Now that's one heck of a seal of approval.
And that's not all. Surfshark also comes with a robust set of secondary precautions. Their RAM-only servers mean that if someone actually seized the servers, all information on them would be gone as soon as they were disconnected. There's also the kill switch feature, which will immediately disconnect an unsecured connection to the internet should the VPN connection drop. And finally, Surfshark Alerts sends immediate warnings to you if your info shows up on leaked databases, keeping you one step ahead of anyone trying to change your logins before your accounts are taken over.
Not to mention all this protection is available for an unlimited number of devices with just one subscription.
Personally, I take this stuff supremely seriously and have been using Surfshark for myself. So if you want to look into getting an added layer of security for yourself, pop on over to surfshark.deal/Gaijin and use the code Gaijin to get 83% off a 2-year plan plus 3 additional months of coverage thrown in for free. While Daimyo had to pay samurai in land, rice, and expensive tea utensils, you only need to pay $2.21 per month for your network of protection online. So be sure to check out Surfshark today. Anyway, to answer your question about where to start when it comes to Magic the Gathering Samurai, dude, that's easy. We start with the mechanic that sealed samurai infamy in the MTG franchise for 20 years. See, back in 2004, when Champions of Kamigawa first dropped, all samurai creature type cards were paired with a new mechanic, bushido. When this blocks or becomes blocked, it gets +X until end of turn, where X is the creature's bushido number. While that might seem like a really solid ability, especially for cheaper, weaker creatures to get swollen combat with, mechanically it was pretty boring for 2 reasons. 1, it lacked a lot of synergy with other strategies from other cards, and 2, it was an ability that only triggered if the samurai was blocking or being blocked. Considering that most samurai cards from the Kamigawa block were typically cheap and fairly weak creatures, it was actually more beneficial in most cases to just not even bother blocking against samurai cards. Just take the minimal damage and then, if anything, now the samurai can't be used to block, which would give it its buff. Blocking is such a small concept in the grand scheme of things of the game that it neither mattered all that much nor did it synergize with anything. Yet, despite how boring and unhelpful the bushido mechanic is, I really do think that it's a mechanic that is 100% rooted into the concept of what samurai were.
But take special note that we said rooted in the concept of samurai, not bushido. As far as I can tell, that was just a bit of a slapdash name to make it all sound more samurai-y. Because the reality is, Bushido was not an all-encompassing concept for samurai throughout their millennia of existence. In fact, the concept of bushido wasn't even seen in written form until the Edo period. Not only was this the twilight years of the samurai class, but the Edo period, being the artistic renaissance period of Japan, became so enamored with artistic romanticizations and embellishments of history that it became harder and harder to discern fact from fiction when it came to the real history of samurai. Now, does this mean that samurai never took to heart aspects of the Bushido Code? Absolutely not. Much of the Bushido Code, courage, politeness, honor, and loyalty, were all concepts well acquainted with samurai of the past, but these were concepts that had been passed down through Japan's absorption of Confucianism and Buddhism, not specifically Bushido. You also have to consider the fact that the Edo period was the first time the country saw national peace in hundreds of years. Because of this, samurai were becoming more and more obsolete, becoming more and more of an administrative class rather than a warrior class. In this, samurai were losing more and more of their own image of being warriors, and many would attempt to cling to the old days through after-the-fact concepts like Bushido. A concept that, as time passed, changed continuously to add more and more ideals under what became understood as the, quote, way of the warrior. But in truth, during the golden age of samurai, many followed similar concepts adopted through Confucianism and or Buddhism. These were not a hard code that every samurai followed. They were, like chivalry, open to individual, informal interpretation. So, no, Bushido doesn't really correlate well to an X power X defense buff being on the battlefield.
Well, again, true, but it does very well to samurai in general. I admit this may be more anecdotal than anything, but to give samurai in Magic the Gathering a standardized tribal mechanic that only applies to conflicting combat is supremely on point historically. Let me make one thing very, very clear. To be samurai is to fight. Underscore, 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 period. Sure, you can apply the concepts of Bushido to other aspects of life, but as Little G just explained, that was so after the fact that when it came to samurai history, that's borderline revisionism. Everything that made samurai samurai was combat. And to prove my point, let me just briefly go through the history of samurai in Japan really quick. From their beginnings in the Heian period, they were little more than small-scale PMCs hired by well-to-do landowners who became so powerful they inevitably overtook the emperor himself in terms of real power and ran the country after two of the greatest samurai clans, the Taira and the Minamoto, fought each other during the Genpei War. Then came the Mongol invasions, which was a massive military undertaking. And then a short time after that, you have the Ashikaga shogunate re-establishing shogunate rule from Emperor Go-Daigo in the Genko War. And then from their weakening power, it led to the Onin Succession Crisis War. And then from that, when central authority completely broke down, there was the Sengoku Jidai Warring States period. And that finally evolved into the aforementioned Edo period of peace. And even that peace only lasted 265 years as the Boshin War came thundering around the corner, which finally and truly ended the era of samurai. All of this, these nearly 1,000 years are times of war. War is what defined samurai. It's what gave them purpose, authority, wealth. It's what gave them power. Thus, despite Bushido being a pretty weak mechanic in Magic the Gathering, aesthetically, it's the most samurai mechanic that could have been given to them.
That is until the release of Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, almost 20 years later. Fans of Magic the Gathering were able to return to the plane of Kamigawa and see what's been happening lore-wise after a 1,200-year time jump. But despite Kamigawa now having the norms of giant hulking mechs, cyberware samurai, tech thief ninja, and mononofu MCs, really, there's a new unnamed mechanic that samurai creature cards began to revolve around that absolutely needs looking into.
Bro, it's so wild. The majority of samurai cards in this block possesses the unnamed mechanic of whenever a samurai or warrior you control attacks alone, you may capitalize on some benefit. These could be the addition of long-established mechanics like bonuses to power and defense, lifelink, or tapping opponent's creatures, or it could be utterly game-changing mechanics like casting spells from your graveyard, spell cost reduction, or even having an additional combat phase after the first. Heck, there's even a card that doubles these one-on-one combat effects, putting an even greater emphasis on samurai attacking by themselves. Now, while some people may think this harkens back to the image of two samurai facing off in Ikiuchi one-on-one duels to the death like we see in so many movies, or even read about involving great samurai like the legendary duelist Miyamoto Musashi, author of the book The Five Rings, I disagree. Because while there have been a few cards and mechanics in the past, like the fight mechanic that has two creatures dealing damage to each other, the combat phase in Magic itself represents a wide battlefield with multiple troops on both sides. But it's this very reason that I think the new samurai mechanic in Kamigawa Neon Dynasty actually pulls from even greater samurai history based on their old styling of open field warfare. I can't prove it, but I believe that this game mechanic, theoretically speaking, pulls way back to the near start of samurai history, all the way back between the 8 and 1200s. During this time, samurai were not defined by the sword or even the spear, but rather the bow, in a loose universal fighting style samurai shared called Kyuba no Michi, or the way of horse and bow. Now, we went into massive detail about this fighting style / belief system in our previous Witch Samurai episode, so I'll just quickly reiterate that through this style of combat, samurai on the battlefield underwent a somewhat standardized process of fighting. On the day of battle, commanders of both sides would exchange words, and upon their return, the whistling or flaming kaburaya arrow would signal the start of the all-out charge, or the kumiuchi. At this time, samurai and retainers alike would search the battlefield for other high-rank-looking samurai to combat. This was done specifically because, as previously mentioned, samurai were not a government-sponsored military. They were basically highly organized mercenaries, and the only way that the warriors would climb up the ranks or even get paid was to take and present the head of a high-ranking opponent to one's lord or general. It was through this process that commoners could become a samurai, but more on that later. When two samurai and their retainers finally met on the field of open combat, they would shout their name, rank, and some would even say personal exploits, to each other and then begin fighting. First with the bow and then with the polearm should the need arise. One such set of duels on the field was actually recorded during the Battle of Kurikara in 1183 in the Heike Monogatari. Kiso Yoshinaka of the Minamoto clan found himself against a much larger army under Taira Munemori at Kurikara Pass, but he had an ambush plan that capitalized on the strict samurai culture of dueling. He detached 3 units to hide under the pass and then marched to Munenori's army. After the two sides met, the kaburaya arrow was fired, and then the armies exchanged arrow volleys, then exchanged close quarters combat, with samurai on both sides meeting, exchanging rank, and fighting each other in the aforementioned standardized way in order to gain heads, thus notoriety. Fighting in this way was not about army size, but rather a focus on an individual's fighting capability, something that this new Magic the Gathering mechanic also focuses on, and something Yoshinaka took complete advantage of. As night fell and the Taira believed they saw the full strength of Yoshinaka's numbers, Yoshinaka's 3 detachments made their way up to join the main army, and with a stampede of angry oxen with fire tied to their horns, stormed the Taira camp. And the Taira were slaughtered outright and the Minamoto were victorious despite being outnumbered 8-1. Now, regardless of this victory coming at the abuse of ritualistic combat on the Miyamoto side of things, it does go to show that this type of formalized dueling did exist to some extent. So in a very real way, I think this new MTG mechanic of having samurai attack alone and gaining huge buffs from other samurai creature cards doing so parallels this idea of Kyuba no Michi style combat, where samurai were all focused on and empowered by on-the-field singular combat. I mean, shoot, if you have a specific army of samurai on your end of the table, you could literally reenact the Battle of Kurikawa by first attacking with a single samurai card, gaining a ton of buffs from other samurai for attacking alone, then use a card like Dayu Storm's Edge to create a second combat phase to theoretically overpower an opponent who's probably spent a lot of resources trying to deal with the first attack. Just like how Yoshinaka dropped an additional surprise attack on Munenori's army after a day of ritualistic dueling. What, am I wrong?
Well, possibly. There's actually a lot of dispute out there whether or not samurai would ritualistically duel on the battlefield under the Kyuba no Michi Code of Engagement. I mean, by your own words, the Battle of Kurikawa wasn't mourned by ritualistic dueling, but an ambush. And based on a few findings that I've gathered, 41 out of 58 Heian period battles recorded in non-literary sources were battles won by ambush tactics. You also have to consider the notion that samurai fought with their retainers rather than completely alone. And if one of those attendants saw an opening to attack an opponent samurai, they did. That is, after all, how a retainer or commoner could propel themselves into samurai status. During the Battle of Azugashiyama in 1189, recorded in the Azuma Kagami, it's written that one Katsuo Taro Hidekata targeted and went after another named Kudojiro Yukimitsu. But as Hidekata got close, Yukimitsu's retainer named Tol Gohan cut off his lord's attacker, engaged in combat, and was victorious against Hidekata. Tol Gohan had zero intention of letting Hidekata fight Yukimitsu one-on-one. Then there's all the anecdotal and logical evidence. In not only written accounts, but also within numerous depictions of battles during the Heian period and Genpei War, mounted samurai archers were seen working in units. This is not only confirmed from the perspective of Takezake Tsunenaga, who fought against the Mongol invasion in the late 1200s, but there's also Chinese sources that took into account the organization of samurai units. And dude, come on. In a pitched battle of thousands of samurai, are each one really going to just ride around screaming their name, rank, and accomplishments over and over? And what if they came across an enemy samurai who didn't have equal or higher accomplishments and status? Would that samurai just ignore that enemy? If anything, samurai would shout out their names as they clashed so that their possible victory could be confirmed with an eyewitness as evidence. But that's about it. Look, I'm not saying that duels never happen, nor that samurai never sought out single targets that appeared to have higher rank, because again, that was the only way for samurai to advance rank and get paid. But to say that samurai always paired off, gave elaborate speeches about their pedigree, and then fought undisturbed one-on-one doesn't seem super feasible when it came to army versus army warfare. And don't get me wrong, I also think samurai and Kamigawa Neon Dynasty are capitalizing on this concept, but we would be remiss if we claimed it was 100% historically accurate.
Well, if we're going into the realms of speculation, there are just a few individual cards from the 4 Kamigawa sets that maybe weren't purposely inspired by samurai history and folk stories, but they might as well have been. Like, take the Bushi Tenderfoot for example. A 1/1 for 1 white mana seems pretty basic, and judging from his attire of a simple Domato chess piece and Jingasa hat, and his status as a simple soldier, I would absolutely assume that this guy is a simple Ashigaru foot soldier. However, if a creature would be put into the graveyard from taking damage from this guy, he literally flips around into Kenzo the Hard-Hearted, a 3/4 double-striking samurai creature card with Bushido 2, making him a potential 5/6 on the battlefield for 1 mana. I have no doubt in my mind that this is a reference to the way that commoners could be elevated to samurai status by successfully defeating and presenting the head of a higher-ranking samurai to their lord after a battle. Then there's a few other samurai cards from the original Kamigawa block, like the Ronin Cliff Rider or Takeno's Cavalry. Not only are they mounted, you know, that thing that real samurai had complete exclusion to, but they also provide sources of targeted damage, something that could be interpreted as range damage. Something that, as we stated before, was central to the martial concept of samurai. Oh man, and speaking of mounted samurai, between the OG Kamigawa blocks and Neon Dynasty, there's more than a few samurai mounted on moths. Something that gave me pause as to why samurai would be riding moths. You know, nature's adorable, derpy, fluffy flyers. Well, I came to find that moths have a lot of symbolism in Japan. Not only for a complete awareness, as moths can sense their surroundings even in complete darkness, but also the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. I mean, any Godzilla fan could probably figure that one out. But just as Buddhism appealed to samurai due to its focus on life, death, and rebirth, so too does the moth make for a culturally symmetrical match with samurai. Finally, and this is gonna sound really corny, but I have a lot of love for the selfless samurai of Neon Dynasty. With not only its lifelink ability, but also its sacrificial ability to grant indestructibility to another creature card. I think the idea of a samurai sacrificing themselves to protect another, more specifically their lord's interests, goes without saying. But if you want a really cool story of samurai sacrifice, check out the story of Kusunoki Masashige from the Shogunate channel. And then there's the concept of lifelink, which this creature has. Lifelink in game meaning that any creature who deals damage heals the player that controls it for the same amount of damage that it did. So the actions of this particular samurai, therefore, benefits and protects the player, who I would assume is the lord in the situation. But like I said, it's kind of a corny thing to think about.
But it's still worth thinking about because I think it really does go without saying that despite some historical inaccuracies, Magic the Gathering Samurai goes hard and deep into the actual records of samurai, both fact and fiction.
But what do you all think of this? Let me know in the comments below, as I do actually read them. But while you do, I want to give one more big thank you to this video sponsor, Surfshark. If you're looking for protection against IP and DNS leaks, public Wi-Fi encryption protection, or just accessing streaming media libraries overseas, hit up surfshark.deal/Gaijin and use the code Gaijin to get 83% off a 2-year subscription plus 3 free months. Otherwise, sub up, get notified, and check out the channel page once a week or so, because we got plenty more Samurai Synopsis and other culture and media videos coming down the pipeline. But as always, until next time everyone, this is Gaijin Goombah, signing out.